even considering the exceptional character of Revelations. Therefore, to keep me from being too elated, a thorn was given to me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from being too elated. 3 times I appealed to the Lord about this, that it would leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness. So I will boast all the more gladly of my weakness, so that the power of Christ in me may dwell in me. Therefore I am content with weakness, insults, hardships, persecution, and calamities for the sake of Christ. For whenever I am weak, then I am strong.
Lord, may the words of my mouth and meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. We hear a lot about Paul in the New Testament, and yet there are things that we should know about him to put everything in context and appreciate the reading we have this morning. For the Apostle Paul was born with the name Saul. He was born somewhere between 2 and 10 CE, which for most of us that means AD, but modern people are calling it the Common Era. He was born in Tarsus, which was a Roman capital, the Roman province in southeast Turkey. His parents named him Saul. His mother by tradition was Jewish, his father was a Roman, and so Saul enjoyed a dual citizenship, which he would use to his advantage later in his life and his ministry after he became a Christian. At about age 10, his parents sent him to Jerusalem to study at the rabbinic school that was headed by the leading rabbi of the day, Rabbi Gamaliel. Here Saul became a radical Pharisaic Jew, who in the earliest days of Christianity as it was starting, Paul was one of those who went out and pursued those who were turning away from their Jewish faith, turning to become followers of Jesus. So he rounded them up, drugged them into the synagogues where they were interrogated, persecuted, until they were willing to renounce their faith and return to the Jewish faith. About 10 years after Jesus' resurrection, the Christian faith is spreading, and Saul has requested letters of permission from the high priest in Jerusalem to go to the city of Damascus, where he's heard that there are a number of new converts to Christianity, and he was to round up these folks there, bind them, drag them back to Jerusalem so that they may be interrogated and persecuted. The 9th chapter of Acts tells his story as to when he is on the way to Damascus, that he is struck by a bright light. He's knocked to the ground and he's struck blind. And then he hears a voice, and the voice says to him, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? And laying on the ground and not being able to see, Saul says, who is it that's speaking to me? And the voice says, I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. Get up and go to Damascus, and you will be told what to do. In the days that immediately followed, Saul, the radical, zealous Jewish Pharisee, was converted to Christianity. He was healed by a Christian, Ananias, and his name was changed to Paul, which also means small. He became the prominent Christian missionary of the first century, as leading preacher and teacher of the faith, spending the rest of his life establishing churches throughout Asia Minor and throughout Greece. Paul is credited with writing 13 of the 27 books in the New Testament. Scholars will debate this, and they will say that he only wrote 8 of them. I'll let you decide how many you want to think Paul really wrote. But nonetheless, in either court that you stand, Paul is given credit for having written 2 Corinthians. To me, the letter of the 2 Corinthians is kind of a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde kind of book. And in that, I mean that as you read 2 Corinthians, the first 9 chapters seem to sound as though things are going great in the church. There's been a reconciliation. There had been differences, but now there's a reconciliation. People are actually getting along together, if you can imagine that. And as a result, when you get to chapter 10, all of a sudden the mood of the language shifts. And in the 10, 11, 12, 13 to the end of the letter, sometimes this is called the severe letter. It's here that we hear that Paul is being ridiculed, he's being mocked, he's being scorned and insulted as he never has been before. For while Paul has been away from the church at Corinth, it has come under the influence of super apostles or false teachers. They are the ones who feel superior to everyone else, even superior to Paul. They are skilled in speech and oratory and debate. And they've done great works. They've demonstrated their superiority over everyone, and to this, Paul takes great offense when he hears about it. So what does Paul do? Paul goes on the offensive. Instead of just sitting back and taking this, Paul tells them of his experiences of ministry, of his sufferings, of his ministries, his rejections, his refusals, and presents these as his credentials and as his resume to show that he indeed is an authentic apostle. As a missionary, Paul suffered countless imprisonments, floggings, and often to the point of near death. His letters and the book of Acts tell us that Paul is beaten at least 5 times with the traditional 40 lashes minus 1 with the whip. 3 times he's beaten with rods. Once he's even stoned. 3 times he's shipwrecked at sea. 1 time escaping dangerous crowds of a city who were out to get him, only to be lowered in a basket over the city wall so he could escape the city. And on frequent journeys, Paul faced many dangerous situations of flooded rivers, being seized upon by bandits, attacked by Jews and Gentiles alike who opposed him. He suffered sleepless nights as he worried about his churches, went without food and water, and was even abandoned and left naked. Then Paul says, despite all that has happened to me, am I weak? No, Paul says. Did these things cause me to stumble and stop preaching the word of Christ? No, Paul says. Am I indignant because of my suffering and my pain? No, Paul says. But if I boast, I will boast of my weakness, because in my weakness, Paul says, I am made strong. To illustrate that, he speaks of his thorn in the flesh that Boo started reading about this morning. This thorn in the flesh, he says, is given to him as a message from Satan. Now, this message from Satan may sound like a contradiction to some of you, but we need to remember that in biblical theology, while God is ultimately in charge and in control of all things, God permits or makes use of Satan to accomplish God's purposes. All you need to do is go back and read the opening part of the book of Job, and you'll see that nicely illustrated. But just what is Paul's thorn in the flesh? We don't know. We are never told. But again, because we have biblical scholars, we have all kinds of projections and guesses as to what it might have been. Perhaps they're suggested that Paul really is talking about this thorn in the flesh being times of persecution. Perhaps it's a time of moral temptation. And wouldn't that make the headlines of the newspapers today? Perhaps it was a physical affliction. Maybe it was migraine headaches, or leprosy, or malaria, or a speech impediment, or some chronic disease, or a repulsive eye disease. And once I even had a seminary professor suggest that Paul's thorn in the flesh was his wife. I think that said more about the professor's marriage than it said about him. We are never told whether or not Paul was married. Tradition would hold that he probably wasn't. But whatever that thorn was, Paul says he prayed 3 times for it to be removed. But even Paul's prayers are not answered in the way that he supposed was best for him or for his ministry. It was only in retrospect, as he looked back, only in retrospect that he understood the thorn as an aspect of God's will for him. But he did not understand it at the time. He didn't understand it at the time of his pain and discomfort. And then the answer Paul received was God simply saying to him, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in your weakness." Paul received no explanation from God along the lines of suffering, that suffering was maybe somehow good for him. God didn't say, "Well, Paul, you know, suffering strengthens you. It builds your character. It helps you develop patience. It produces endurance. You know, Paul, suffering's good for you." No, God doesn't tell Paul that. God tells Paul that his grace is sufficient, for God's power is made perfect in Paul's weakness. Traditionally, grace is defined as the unmerited or unearned favor or love of God that forgives us even when we don't deserve it. But when grace is linked to power, God's power, then grace becomes the strength of the Holy Spirit active in human life when we acknowledge our weaknesses and appeal to God for help. And once Paul learned that weakness that came from the messages of Satan could be borne with God's strength, then Paul learned something that he could apply to the weaknesses which afflicted him, whether those weaknesses were caused by insults, injuries, persecutions, calamities, or what have you. Yes, things that could and did get Paul down from time to time, but then he would remember that to carry on, he should not rely on his own inner strength, but only rely on God. For Paul closes saying, "Whenever I am weak, then I am strong." When we accept and acknowledge our weaknesses to God, then God's grace can give us strength we never knew we had. In the spring of 1997, my younger brother David, whom many of you have been praying for and have been nice to ask about, Dave was 46 years old and was diagnosed with cardiomyopathy. In short, that meant that his heart was shutting down and was functioning only at about 15 or 20% of what it should have. He went through a series of tests, and it appeared that he needed a heart transplant. But the problem was that he was not in as dire of a need for a new heart as many others who were ahead of him on the list. And so he didn't make the transplant list. Instead, he was treated with medications, some of them experimental, and numerous churches had him on their prayer lists. As many of you, our family felt helpless in what we could do for Dave. But time went on. About 4 months later, after a series of routine tests, the cardiologist calls him like at 7:30 on a Friday night to tell him, Dave, I don't know what's happening, but it appears as though your heart is starting to get stronger. Now our mother reminded him and all of us that while the medications were doing their job, she was convinced that prayer was what made the difference. And who's going to argue with their mother? Now Dave did have to give up his former life as a volunteer fireman in his community and in a regional sales position that he enjoyed for an agricultural company. But he adjusted, and things went well for him for the next 20 years. Then last year, he started having some issues again. His heart was not functioning as it should, and he was retaining fluid, making it difficult for him to breathe, difficult with mobility and basic functioning. After a period of time, he was referred to a cardiac care group at Loyola Hospital in Chicago. He was hospitalized for a couple of weeks, had a series of tests, and things were improving, especially when they removed some 20 liters of fluid from his body. Long story short, he was again being considered for a heart transplant. Except, during the testing, they found a spot on his kidney that had been discovered 15 years before, and nobody seemed to be concerned to do anything about it. But now, it was different because he was told that it was cancerous, and he would have to be cancer-free for a year before he could even go on the heart transplant list. So they did a bone marrow test, and they found a few of those cantankerous, cancerous cells that they said were manageable, but if he were to have a transplant, the anti-rejection medications that he would take would just feed those cancerous cells, and they would multiply and balloon like crazy. So now he's home, and he has some good days and some days that are maybe not so good. And the doctors are still trying to figure out what to do next. So when I talked to him the other day, I said, Dave, how you doing? You know, how brothers talk. He responded saying, well, you know, Tom, in 1997, the doctor said I only had 5 years to live, at the most. And I guess I've done better than that. So now, I have to accept what's happening, do the best that I can, and I have to play the hand that I've been dealt. My prayer for Dave and for all who face an illness, a loss, an injury, a hardship, persecution, or some other calamity, is that we may acknowledge and accept our weaknesses, and that we may then hear that still small voice from deep inside say, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Let us pray. Gracious God, we come to you this day. We hear your word, and you speak your word of grace to each of us. As we come, we pause in these moments. We reflect, we think, we wonder, and we listen. But we also come and acknowledge who you are in our day and in our life when we offer you this prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into